Hello, everyone. Welcome to NNUG meeting. So my name is Evgeny Barzenin, and I will be your host for today's event. Before we start our session today, let me spend 5 minutes and introduce what our group is, what we do, who we are, because there are some new people who join our meetup for the first time. Welcome. NNUG, that's a Norwegian .NET user group, and we are part of .NET Foundation, and we are an independent user group with focus on .NET technology and technology around .NET. So we group run by developers and for developers, and our main focus is on talks where presenters have a practical experience or real-life use cases, because I think that's the most interesting part to present. So at the same time, so we're constantly looking for new topics to discuss and new people to join and present things. So if you have new interesting topic to discuss, or if you know someone who has some real-life use cases or some practical experience to share, please contact us on email or YouTube or Twitch or any other social media. We would not be able to run periodically or regularly release new sessions without our sponsors. So thanks for all our sponsors. It would be hard without you. And so who we are. So today we have 8 awesome people on our board. And again, if you have any questions or if you have any new interesting topic to discuss, please reach out to us. You can easily find us on different social media. We are constantly looking to improve ourselves. So, and therefore we compose this questionnaire, and we really need your help with input on what topics or what kind of format for the event you would like us to do in the future. So I will post the link later on the comments. Okay, Microsoft has, as always, you can you can send a link and get a learner badge from Microsoft. And also the best technical question that you will ask today will be, the person who asks this question will receive a swag pack from Microsoft. So please be active. Please don't hesitate to send your questions, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of our presentation. Right, and today I'm really happy to announce Isaac Abraham, who will talk about repeatable deployments on Azure with Farmer. And actually, first time when I heard about Farmer, that was June this year, and I wish I knew about this product at least half a year before, because at that time, like if we knew about this product when we started to make some infrastructure as code decisions in our project, most likely we will make completely different decisions. So I'm really excited to see what he will present today. And yes, Isaac, the scene is yours. Have fun.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So yeah, Farmer today. Before I sort of get started with the slides, if any of you have questions, I actually can't see how many people are in the room or whatever, but if you've got questions, just post them, and then either I'll see them in the comments section, or Evgeny will post them in the chat room, in the video stream, and I'll either answer them straight away or we'll come back to them later on. But don't feel that you have to wait until the very end if you've got a specific question while I'm going through this, and there will be time at the end as well for Q&A. So great. So what I'll do then is just switch over. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Oh, it's gone again. There we go. Right. So I've got a slide deck. I'm going to whiz through some of the slides and maybe spend 15 minutes on this, maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll talk more about the code side of things, do some demos, And then maybe have more of a Q&A at the end about use cases, how you might want to use Farmer, and so on. So just a little bit about me. Let me give focus to that window. Otherwise, this isn't going to be a great session. Here we go. Right. So just a tiny bit about me. So I'm the founder of Compositional IT. We're an F# and Azure consultancy. We do development, training, consultancy, de-risking, and so on. I've been a .NET developer since the very beginning. So the early days of C# 1, 1.0, before generics. Been using F# for around 5 years now, but my background is heavily in the C# OO background. And then I've kind of slowly transitioned over to a more functional background with F#. As you can tell from my accent, I'm British. So I come from London. I now live in Germany for a few years now, just in time for Brexit. Obviously, I can't easily do a show of hands. I'm imagining some of you are .NET developers, some of you are going to be Azure consultants. Some of you maybe are neither of them, but you're just interested. But I'm going to sort of make some assumptions at that point. And then if we have any sort of questions or so on, feel free to ask throughout. So what I'm going to cover is sort of the story of how I understand infrastructure in Azure today, how we create them. A look at ARM templates. I'm not going to demo them too much today, but in fact at all, but I will talk about them. And then give a bit of the value proposition of Farmer, when we created it, how we did it, and then some demos and so on. So just an overview then to start with, in terms of deploying Azure infrastructure today. And the first question I would have is, excuse me, why don't we automate infrastructure? So I think a lot of people will do this kind of CI/CD for your code. It's very common to say, I've got an application, I want to run unit tests and build it as part of, TeamCity or GitHub or Azure DevOps or whatever. That sort of bit, people have done that. It's well documented, it's well understood. Not so many people are doing the infrastructure side of things today. I'm not entirely sure why this is, or I have some ideas, but people tend not to do this as much. It's not considered as necessary. It's not considered as easy to do. And that's really where I started with Farmer, was understanding why are people not doing this. And when we started to try and automate our infrastructure, we quickly realized what some of these problems were. If you look at how you're doing it today and you go on to, Microsoft websites or Azure or blogs, you'll find a whole set of different options for creating infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean creating a SQL server or an app service in Azure or a Cosmos DB instance, those sorts of things. So not necessarily the code that lives on them, but just the raw resources. So the most obvious one that people will look at and tend to start with is to just use the portal. You log in, portalazure.com, you'll click around, you'll follow the wizard, and you'll get some resources. And it's so easy to get started with this. It's relatively straightforward. Next, you hit create, and 99 times out of 100 it works. You get your resources, off you go. Problems are, it's totally unrepeatable. If you want to do this again, obviously you have to do it again and make sure you click the same options. Doesn't scale. So if you've got larger resources or more complex resources, you just can't manually do this. The effort becomes very, very onerous very quickly, takes a lot of time, and it doesn't always apply to code. It's typically just the infrastructure side of things, and then you still have to worry about deploying the code into the infrastructure. The next one I tend to see is this right-click publish option, which a lot of people are using as well. It's kind of what I would consider like the next step up from using infrastructure as code. Using the portal. So it's pretty easy to start. You can right-click on a project, and Visual Studio will give you all these options for the types of things you want to deploy. It can do code as well. So, for example, you can create an ASP.NET web app in Azure, in Visual Studio, and you can say publish to Azure. And it will not only create the resources, but it will then bundle up your code and publish it as well. Once again, not repeatable though, doesn't scale particularly well, and it's got limited use cases. By that I mean you can only use the wizards that Microsoft deemed worthy of investing the time and effort into creating these wizards, And of course, it's Visual Studio only. So if you're on Linux or Mac, you're pretty much out of luck there. If you're not a Visual Studio user, you're out of luck. So not so great. And everyone always says don't right-click publish. So people start to look at then what I call code-focused deployments. So these are things that are designed to be repeatable. And Microsoft themselves have got like 4 or 5 different options. So you've got PowerShell and the Azure CLI, which are command line driven sort of options. There's a .NET SDK on top of the REST API, which is a low-level HTTP API. And then you've got ARM templates, which we'll talk about in a bit. And even today now, there's a new sort of version of ARM called Bicep, which is kind of ARM v2, if you will. There are 2 other sort of commercial options out there. So there's Terraform and Pulumi, both of which have slightly different approaches. But again, another way of creating repeatable deployments in Azure. So I'll just look at these kind of, let's skip that. So just a kind of an architecture, how it sort of sits together. This is not entirely accurate, but it's a simplistic way of seeing how things work. So you have this kind of REST API on the left, where you've got things like PowerShell, the Azure CLI, the Fluent APIs that I mentioned before. And then on top of that, you've got services like Pulumi and Terraform, which have their own what are called state service. So if you do a deployment and then you do a second deployment, it can understand the diff between the two and understands what APIs to call and so on. And then on the right-hand side, you have ARM templates, which have got this kind of Resource Manager API, where you can send a JSON file, which is what ARM templates are, that contains all the information about these are the resources I want, and the Resource Manager API will do its thing and understand what to provision and deprovision. So it's almost like a kind of compete with this kind of service here, this one down here. So ARM templates, as I said, are these JSON files. There are some really good things about them. So one of the best things that ARM sort of promises us is this idea of idempotent deployments. The idea that you can run the same deployment again and again, and ARM will understand in this JSON file is a web app and a SQL server. Oh, I've already got those. I don't have to do anything. And if you make a change, it will only change the bits that have actually changed. It supports loads of Azure resources, basically all of them. It's cross-platform. It's got good tooling support, cross-tooling support, I should say. So it runs on different ways. You've got the CLI, you've got HTTP and so on. And you've got this notion of recording and auditing deployments. So you can push an ARM template into Azure, and then you can see in the portal, on this date, this person ran this deployment. This is what they gave us to do. This is what we did, sort of thing. Great. Really nice. Why wouldn't you want to use ARM? And I would divide this into 2 groups of people. So for people that are already using ARM templates, normally the feedback I get is deployment experiences are very positive. Basically, all the things I just mentioned. The bits that are not positive is the authoring side of things, creating these JSON files, these ARM templates. So if you've done this before, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, where I say it's not always a positive experience. So that's one side. The other half is people that are looking to get into infrastructure as code from a beginner's point of view. People maybe that are using right-click deploy today or the portal that have heard that infrastructure as code is something that they should be looking into. What they'll often do is try it, look at the documentation, read the blogs that talk about how great it is, but then give up and go back to doing it the old way, because it's really not easy to get up and running. You have to know a lot of secret sort of ways of doing things. The tooling, although it's improved, is still not what I would consider very user-friendly and doesn't really lead to the pit of success. There are many reasons why that is. But either way, it's either people that know what they're doing, get it working, but they know it's going to take a long time, and people that don't know simply will give up quickly and go back. And this is why I think I've sort of written down how I figure out ARM templates today, how we work them out, and how most people tend to use them. So the first time you'll try and do an ARM template, there's a site called Azure Samples 101, which is a GitHub repository that Microsoft have created, which has loads of different ARM templates. And you'll probably look through the code of them, and you'll have a look for a sample that has the bit that you need, and then try and extract just the relevant bits that you actually want, get it working, and then move on. That doesn't always work though, so you may try community. Google, have a look at some blogs, look on Stack Overflow. If you're lucky, you'll get some answers there. Or people will sometimes try and create a template in the portal. So you can create the resources and then ask the portal to reverse engineer an ARM template from actual live resources. Sometimes this will work. And if it does, you can then, again, go through the portal, the template, and see which bits it's actually created. If you're lucky, it'll have the right bits that you're looking for. Or you can try the official resource docs. I wish you good luck. They're often out of date, they're often contradictory, and they're often just don't include the information that you really need. There are also some really bad things about it. The biggest problem is it's really expensive, not only to create, but to maintain. So once you've created your ARM template, obviously you commit it into source control. Someone has to maintain that template over time as you make changes to your infrastructure. It's not easy to do that. There's often a lot of fear associated with that. It's a difficult problem. They're error prone. It's even with some of the tooling enhancements that have been made in the last year or so, it's still quite easy to get things wrong. ARM templates are basically JSON. They're relatively weakly typed. They have some typing support based on some JSON schemas, but there's a limited amount of information in them. Again, they're not kept up to date. And it's generally a challenge to have any degree of confidence that your template will really work. And I think the biggest issue that I have with ARM in general is that it's at the wrong level of abstraction for a user. When I am certainly a beginner looking at creating an ARM template, I have to worry about too many different resources to really get things going quickly. It takes quite a lot of effort and time to get going, particularly if you're using some of the most common resources like a web application or a virtual machine, where you really have to know several different resources and understand how to tie them together. And generally, limited capabilities. By this, what I mean is that there's not so much you can do in a JSON file. Yeah, it's not a Turing-complete language. So within the ARM language, they've effectively made a kind of a domain-specific language through raw strings, where you can concatenate strings together and do some sort of manipulations. But very, very quickly, you hit the edge of what you can do. So ultimately, you'll need lots of documentation that you need to wade through. It's not great. As I said, it's outdated, it's unreliable. I would even say untrustworthy, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on them. To be fair, Microsoft do know this, and they are working towards improving that, which is great. An interesting one as well is that because each different Azure team manages their own Azure resources, there's often an inconsistent experience across them. So the way you create a web app might be very different to how you create a SQL database, because it's two different teams that have designed the schema for those different resources. Slow to validate and fix. So the cycle between typing in a template and actually getting feedback can sometimes be a minute, maybe 5 minutes. So that's not great either, because you have to deploy the template, get the feedback from Azure, tell you what's wrong, you maybe fix it, get another issue further downstream, and so on. So tooling is what I think until recently was seen as the solution. So created a language server so that VS Code has some idea of support for ARM templates, code completion, code snippets, and schema verification. These are all the sorts of things that have been touted over the last year as ways to sort of improve the ARM experience. They do support it and they do enhance it, but my personal view is we really can do much better than this. If you're coming from a strongly typed or any kind of programming language, these sorts of things are things that you would take for granted. The idea of code snippets and code completion and, a compiler is nothing that I would expect as something to shout from the rooftops about. It just feels like going back to the 90s for me, really. There's nothing that I'm too excited about. Code snippets, I would say, is, again, generating code quickly is still code that needs to be maintained at the end. So yes, it may let you get up and running a bit more quickly, but you still have to maintain that at the end of the day. Is that really the answer? All of these things I've just mentioned is VS Code only. So if you want to use a different ID, you're stuck. The schemas, as I mentioned, outdated. Discoverability is really lacking. And JSON and code snippets. Yeah, JSON is I think, a fundamental issue with ARM templates. It's not going away. But this is not the answer in my opinion. And this is really the crux of where I came to with Farmer, is I think we need to rethink how we're working with ARM templates. And Farmer is not the only project, as I mentioned before. And Microsoft themselves have acknowledged this with Bicep. I want something that's quicker to author, quicker to get up and running, quicker and easier to read and understand, particularly from a newcomer's point of view, easier to maintain, more powerful, generally just better, more and better would be my sort of suggestion. So that sort of brings us over to, yes, I've spent the last 10 minutes talking about the problems. What's the solution that we've come up with? Evgeny, if there's any questions at this point, feel free to just put them into the chat.
Yes, sure. But right now, no questions. So please continue.
Thank you. So what's Farmer then? So Farmer is really a library that makes repeatable deployments into Azure easy. That's the real goal of it. If I think of the vision of it, I would love to say that the aim would be that we want to make it as easy or easier to create resources in Azure through code than any other way, easier than the portal even. That may be a goal that we never realize, but that's the where we would love to get to. A longer way of saying what I've just said is it's an easy to learn library for rapidly authoring and deploying entire Azure architectures via ARM templates and the Azure CLI. Importantly, what I've just said, I've spent the last 10 minutes berating ARM templates, and yet I'm talking about them here. So it's important to understand that what Farmer does is essentially generate ARM templates and use the Azure CLI to deploy them. And both of these technologies are cross-platform, which means that you can use Farmer on Mac, on Linux, on Windows. And we use an existing deployment mechanism that works well and is stable. So we're not reinventing the wheel in this regard. We're simply sitting on top of ARM to more rapidly generate these templates. And that goes back to what I said before, is that people found the deployment experience positive, but not so much the authoring experience. And that's the bit that we're trying to really improve here. So it lets you create ARM templates quickly. It lets you deploy them. We're probably not going to look at that today, but at least we'll see about the authoring side. I want you to focus on the high-level concepts of infrastructure. I don't want you thinking about individual components, but more about getting stuff done, but yet still give you these escape hatches if you need to drop down and do your own thing. I would say there are three sort of target audiences that I would look at for Farmer. One are, as I said, newcomers to Azure or newcomers to infrastructure as code. And then the second one would be teams that are already using ARM templates that are used to that deployment mechanism. They understand it. Maybe they've got some infrastructure already built, that want to then transition to something that's a bit easier to write, but still keep going with their existing deployment technologies, whether that's DevOps or TeamCity or whatever, or PowerShell. And the last group is something that is not really possible with ARM, really. And this probably goes back to what Evgeny was talking about before, which is what I call dynamic deploy. And the idea here is that you may have maybe a software service or a platform that needs to provision infrastructure on demand. Maybe a customer, wants to run some kind of calculation, needs to provision some virtual machines which you're going to install your code onto. But you want to be able to parameterize that deployment with different resources to fine-tune it and so on. You can do this with ARM templates through parameterization, but it's very, very difficult. Whereas with Farmer, we make that quite easy because we're sitting on top of existing tools and languages. So some of the features I would say are it's highly productive. It's type safe because we're running on top of .NET Core. So Farmer is actually just a library that runs as a NuGet package that runs in F#. It's completely open source, but I would point out that it is commercially supported. So we let you look at the source code. You can run it for your own uses if you want, but we do recommend that if you're using it for production systems, that you look for a support contract with us that is relatively cheap, certainly compared to the cost of writing these templates yourself, because that comes with an SLA then. And it's extensible, which means you can create your own resources on top of and add in resources that aren't yet supported as well if you want. Lastly, and this is a really important thing, is the templates it generates are backwards compatible because it is just ARM templates that we emit at the end of the day. So you can use it as a way to create ARM templates and then hand it off to another team, or you can use it to not only generate the templates, but deploy them as well. Architecturally, we have kind of 3 or 4 different levels. So at the top, we've got what we call builders. And this is what I would consider like the first sort of level that you as a user will interact with Farmer. So you might say, I want to create a web application. And that underneath may make calls to several different resources. So a web app in Azure needs a server farm, it needs web apps, or websites, I think they're called, app insights, and various other resources. We try and abstract those from you so that you don't have to think about them. But if you do want to go down to that level, we let you do that as well. From that, we will generate what we consider like an in-memory representation of all of these resources. We'll also add in any parameters that are needed. So one thing we do try and push people down towards is doing things in a secure way. So for example, if you create a virtual machine, which needs a password, we do not even allow you to push that password as plain text. We simply don't allow that. The only way you can pass that password in is via a secure parameter. So immediately we try and push you down what we would consider best practices, pit of success. And we will also let you get to the outputs of your template, which is quite a useful thing. If you're using your ARM template as part of a longer process, you can consider the deployment as a function in a sense, that you give it some input parameters and you'll get some outputs, which could be a connection string of a storage account. It could be a DNS number or an IP address or something like that, anything really. And finally, we'll create this ARM template, which you can then deploy. If you want to do it yourself, you can do. But if you let Farmer deploy, we can also provide you with what we call post-deploy tasks. And this is outside of the ARM template process, where we will let you do things like wrappers around the Azure CLI, so that inside your Farmer template, you can not only create your ARM template in the infrastructure, but we will also manage deployment of an application into the web app for you without you having to think about that as a one-liner, which is quite nice. So I'm just going to give you some examples of some common ARM tasks, and then we're going to jump into some code for probably 15 minutes. So these are the sorts of things that I see as common problems that will often get people really, stuck, particularly when they're starting up. And if you've done any ARM, you'll know exactly what I mean. Creating a storage account, changing the SKU of the storage account, then create a web app. Maybe I want to hook the two together. Maybe I want to add a setting to the web application. Maybe the setting is the connection string of the storage account so that my code can then start talking to my storage account. Parameterization of resources, maybe using variables. All these sorts of things are common tasks that you will do with an ARM template. If you've never done it before, it can be a bit daunting. So I'm actually not going to show you the ARM template process in the interest of saving time. We're just going to jump straight into the Farmer side of things. So if you've not used ARM templates, I would encourage you to try out these sorts of tasks yourself. See how long it takes you if you've never done it before, and then compare it to what I'm going to show you today. So let's jump over to demos. So first question is Evgeny, is that sort of font size big enough, or should I make that a little bit bigger?
Maybe a little bit bigger, and I think I will remove your face from the broadcast, so then it will be only slides. Is it okay?
Yeah, feel free to. Okay. Hopefully that's okay now. Let's see. Do you need me to remove my face, or can you do that?
Unfortunately, I can't. Sorry. So,
Sorry,
but the font size is perfect. So
yep. Okay. I'm just going to try and remove myself from the stream. You stay on though, because if you can't hear myself, then you need to tell me.
Yes. Yeah, you have to be on the screen. Sorry.
Oh, okay, fine. There you go. Okay, fine. So I'm just in VS Code, and I've literally got nothing, and I'm going to create a project from scratch, and we're going to basically create those sorts of resources that I just mentioned, and it shouldn't take too long to do. For those of you that have used ARM templates in the past, I would encourage you to think about how you would do that and what the distinctions are. I'm going to start by just creating a new console application, which will be in F#. So I'm just going to make this actually, oh no, we should be actually okay with Net 5. No, let's actually make this, yeah, that should be okay. So all I've got here is an empty console application in F#, and I'm going to add onto it the Farmer package. So I can say .NET add package Farmer. That should be all I need to do. And that's all Farmer is. It's a NuGet package. So if you've used .NET before, all the sort of standard tools you use are basically here. Which is, I think, is pretty useful and important to see. That means also that as part of using Farmer, you can create applications that use other NuGet packages as well. And you can run Farmer as an embedded part of your existing apps. That could be a web application that creates ARM templates on demand. Nothing wrong with that. I'm going to start by just removing all my code. And I'm just going to make sure that the package has been pulled down, which it has been. So I'm going to open a couple of namespaces here. And as you remember, I said builders are kind of these abstractions that we have on top of our code. So I'm going to start by doing what's called a .NET watch run. So every time I make a change to my code, the program's going to basically run from scratch. Okay, so that's good. I've got a warning here that says the program's doing nothing. That's fine. I'm going to start by simply creating an empty ARM template and deploying it onto the local file system. So I'll say template equals ARM, and I'm going to say location is location dot, and let's say West Europe. And then I'm going to deploy this template to the local file system using what's called a pipe, which is simply a way of doing like a pipeline goes to. So if you've used like link before in C#, think of it almost like an extension method. I'm going to push it into a function called quick-write, which is going to convert this template into an ARM template, and we'll call it Oslo. Then I'm going to save, and hopefully we will get an ARM template out of this. Okay, so I'm going to put this side by side so we can see as I build up this template what it looks like. There we go. So we've got an empty template here, and it's created the usual sort of the schema, the content version. There are no outputs, no parameters, and no resources. So I'm going to start by creating some resources which will add into the template. So I'll start with a storage account, which we'll call my storage. And we'll call it, let's call it Isaac Oslo. And then to add that resource, I simply say add resource, my storage. You'll see we get some type safety. So this name must be a string. So if I was to put in an integer, we'll get a compiler error, and so on and so forth. So it tries to help us in that regard. I'm going to save this now. And I'll just bring up this. So very shortly, we'll see we've now got a storage account. And it's put in the usual sorts of things. So it's got a specific version, it's defaulted to a specific SKU and a kind, and so on and so forth. Also, you'll notice that we've emitted the location based on the location of the ARM template. So with Farmer, we're kind of opinionated, and we basically say by default, you specify the location once, and we will just apply it to all your resources. You don't have to think about that anywhere else. We also do some validation for you on resources, and this is something we're trying to bring up even further. So if we make an incompatible storage name and you run the app, although we can't give you compile time checking, we can give you runtime checking at the point of generating the template. So here we got an exception. can only contain lowercase letters, for example. So that's just one way that we can save time. Rather than you having to get to the deployment point of view, you won't even get that far when you're trying to deploy your templates. Okay. Of course, we have all the other sorts of parameters here. So SKU, for example, and I can type storage.sku, and you'll see we get a rich list of all of the different types of SKUs that we support. There are actually more than this, which I'll show in a minute, but generally we come up with a preset set of SKUs. And if I change that, then obviously down here on this hand, it will update this to the premium SKU. So I'll add now a second resource or a second app, which I'll call My Web, which is going to be our web application. And we'll call it Isaac Oslo Web. And I'm going to add that resource as well. And what I'll do as well while we're here is I'm going to turn on the preview function in Visual Studio Code, which is a nice extension. It lets us actually visually preview the ARM template as we're creating it. So you can see we've only got one resource at the moment. I'm now going to save that file, and very shortly we'll see a number of resources are created. And again, this is one of the benefits of sitting on top of ARM, is all of this infrastructure has already been created for us. We didn't have to do this. So this extension is just a standard ARM extension, and you can see now we've got a web app, which has got a server farm and an App Insights instance. You'll see that by default, we will automatically pick names, like we'll put -AI for the App Insights instance, and we'll put a -farm for the server farm, things like this. We automatically will set up the dependencies for you. We'll set up a load of settings. So if you've used App Insights before, or if you haven't, App Insights is a tool that allows us to sort of record stats and metrics about a web application, for example. It also has a nice live metrics view. So as you get requests, you'll get a sort of a graph going along. But to get that working out of the box, you have to know all of these secret extensions and settings. We do all of that for you. So you don't have to worry. You just put in basically 3 lines, and you have a fully configured web application that's ready to go with the appropriate default set. And of course, again, here we'll have all the SKU set up. So I can say web app SKU, and then you'll see all of the different types of VMs and sizes that are there. And I can do things like, let's actually do a bit of this. So let's say I wanted a B3, and I want to do always on, and I want to have 3 workers. So number of workers 3. And that's essentially all we have to do. Everything else will be set for us here based on those settings. While I'm talking about settings, let's imagine I wanted to set an app setting. This is something that should be really, really easy to do in ARM. It's not, but in Farmer, it's pretty simple. It's simply setting key value. So let's say city and then Oslo. And once I've saved that and we revisited this, you'll see there that we've now got another setting, city Oslo. Pretty easy to do. Let's get rid of all of those just to make things simple. If you decide you didn't like the sort of default options, I'll just mention here, it's easy to change these. So you can pass in a different name for your App Insights instance, or you can turn it off if you want. That's totally fine. We don't want to force you to do things the way we do, but we do want to give you some defaults that we think apply for maybe 80% of the use cases, if not more. One thing that's important to know in ARM is how to set dependencies, because the nature of ARM templates are declarative. It's just a big JSON file. So you need to be able to tell Azure the order in which to provision resources. And in ARM, you basically create what are called dependencies. So I can say my web app depends on my storage. And when I do this, if I just make this a little bit bigger and drag this to the right, then we'll see in a second that we actually now get this nice arrow here that shows that the storage account is dependent on the web app. So this must be created first before these 3 resources are made. But we even go one step further than that. So imagine I had a setting where I wanted to supply the connection string to the web app. So let's call it something like storage key. Now, the primitive way of doing this, or the way that I see many of our customers work, is they'll deploy the resources without the setting, and then they'll manually go into the portal, get the connection string, and copy it into the web app settings. That works, but obviously, again, it's manual effort, particularly if you've got multiple resources or multiple environments. An alternative way that I've seen people do it is to simply get the connection string and then paste it directly in here, which means it's pasted and stored in your source code. Not a great practice. What we do is let you say my storage dot, and then we get these properties, and I can say key. And that's really all you have to do. What we'll do then is a number of things. The first thing we'll do is within the setting, we'll create your setting for you, which will be called storage key. But this will now be an expression, which is a kind of a command that you can send to ARM that tells it to derive a certain value at deployment time. So you never actually store a secret in code anywhere. Indeed, you never have to actually see this secret at any point in time. So it will be stored in Azure, but you never have to persist it. And it means that it would work for any environment you create. If you parameterize this, it will just work. We've also realized that there's now a storage key coming in. Therefore, the web app has to the storage account and web app have a dependency. So again, you can see there's now a dependency between the two. So you can't create the storage account until you've got the web app, or vice versa, I should say. So that's kind of the defaults. I'm going to jump back to the slides in a minute. I just want to touch on a few more points. So things like if I wanted to make a variable, that's a common thing in ARM templates. We don't actually support variables in ARM. We don't need to because we're using F#, which is a proper programming language. So I can make a variable just natively. So let's call it something like environment equals test. And over here, I can then do things like that if I want. Now I'm using VS Code, which isn't updated actually to the latest version of F#. So I'll do it the longhand way, which is this. That would be the word environment, sorry. And of course, if I mistype this, it's a compiler, so I get a proper compiler error, no such thing as this. And the compiler will even provide me with a suggestion to fix the typo. And I can do the same things across all of here. So I could say this one is going to be that plus environment, for example. That's basically it now. And if I was to test this one out now, this actually won't work. Let's fix that because I've got a dash which isn't allowed. So now I've tested this out. Hopefully we'll get now everything parameterized, and I could even go a step further and say, let's create a function which takes in an environment name and returns the template back out. Suddenly now we've got the ability to create any number of environments simply based on a function called create environment, which takes in a name. So I could say create environment test and then write it to a JSON file. And now I've got everything done for us, really. Not too much work. I'll show you just a couple more things, and then I'll jump back to the slides. I think we've still got 15 minutes left, so that should be plenty of time for some questions if there are any. I'm just going to undo this. One thing I wanted to show you is how far you can take this, and some things that are really difficult to do by hand, but we've tried to make them as easy as possible. A nice feature that's coming out and has been coming out in Azure lately is managed identities, which is a way of doing security without passing in strings and keys and connection strings. So it's a way of saying that the storage account trusts the web app to connect to it, rather than the web app has a key into the storage account. And the way to do that in Pharma is actually pretty trivial nowadays. So the first thing we do is going to flip the dependencies around. So the web app must be created first. And here we can say now, I want to grant access to, and then I can say my web dot system identity. And the access I want to grant it is the role of, now I get all of the different roles. So I can say storage, blob data reader. And that's essentially all we have to do. I think we just have to turn on system identity as well. Yeah. Having done that now, you'll see that a few things will start to pop up in a second. running. Yep. Good. So now if I just make this a little bit bigger, you'll see that we have not only our app insights and our web account, but we have a storage account and now this extra storage blob data reader resource that's been made as well, which is effectively the trust between them that's been created there. So relatively simple to do. We can go one step further and we could create a user account identity if you wanted to. So if I just said Isaac, I could say create user assigned identity. We'll call it Frodo. And we could grant access to this account instead, which is essentially a new user. And I could say add identity Isaac. Let's actually rename that to Frodo. Add that resource. And within a few lines of code now, you've got what actually is, we've got here 15 maybe lines of code, and our template is already at nearly 200 lines, 150 lines of code now. And all of those things have been created quite nicely. So we've got the user account and the other bits alongside it. We support all of what I would consider the most popular resources. I'm just going to jump over back to my browser just to show you briefly what we've got. So I'll just jump over here and show you our API overview. We have a relatively large number of resources, which we call sort of web apps, but actually underneath, obviously they boil down to all sorts of resources behind the scenes. So if I look at web apps, for example, you'll see all the different keywords we support and so on. There's a sample of code and so on how to use it. We've also started adding in recently a set of tutorials. So for example, how to create multiple web applications, diagrams, some code samples, walkthroughs, quick starts, all of that sort of stuff we've started putting as well. Going to just jump back to the slides, but just before I do that, are there any questions? Okay, regarding keys, do you support setup that can handle key rotations? So by key rotations, if you're using something like the managed identity, then that kind of solves that for you because that handles the rotation of keys out of the box. So if you sort of use the managed identity support, the key rotation will happen for free. You don't have to worry about that. Azure manages that for you. You can also use Key Vault, which is something I haven't shown you here, but you can also work with that. Obviously, then you've got to sort of manage parts of that yourself, though. If there are any other questions, I'll just wait a few seconds. Otherwise, then we'll jump back to the slides. Okay. That's a good question from David. So David asks, what's the latency between a new Azure resource that's or change that's added and available day one in ARM templates and Bicep, and when is it supported in Pharma? It really depends. Our approach has never been to try and replicate every single field and every single resource in Azure unless there's demand for it. So when people are asking us to add resources in, we will then allow you to, we will then basically push that forward into our backlog. If you've got a support plan with us, then we'll obviously push that forward and escalate that. Some resources are very, very quick and easy to add in. Some are slightly more complex. Largely that depends on the documentation and the quality of support that we've got from Microsoft in that regard. Some resources are really well defined and documented, some are not so well, I have to say. Another question there was, can I configure App Insights with Pharma? Yes, you can. So I've only shown you App Insights within the context of a web app, but you can create App Insights on its own. So there's another block called App Insights, and you can configure things not only like the name, but also things like the sampling rate as well. And then you can manually hook that up into your web app or functions instance or whatever else you want. So if I go here and look, there should be an App Insights instance here. So you can see there what you can configure. Okay, good. If you've got any other questions, keep firing them away. I'm just going to go through a couple more slides and then I'll come back again. So just finished with some use cases for Pharma that I already touched on. So authoring ARM templates, which is what I've shown you. Deploying ARM templates, I've not shown you that, but there's essentially another keyword that you can, another command you can call, effectively the same as the quick write, which I showed you, which was writing to JSON, which is simply deploy to this resource group name. We will then call the Azure client behind the scenes for you. We'll log in or provide you with the login experience that the Azure client will use. You can then essentially specify the subscription, the resource group name, and pass in any parameters that we've created. If we've got time, I will just jump back and do a couple more quick demos, but I didn't want to leave this last bit out, so we'll see how we are with time on that. Part of a build script, so if you've got a CI/CD process and you've got a build process, nothing to stop you calling that from there. Yeah, already touched on this. One nice thing is things like DevOps that have ARM support built in, or Octopus, you can still use Pharma to just generate the ARM template and then immediately hand over to them to do the deployment process. No reason why you can't. And I already mentioned, as part of a running app, software services, you could definitely use Pharma. I just want to touch on some of the benefits of .NET that we get. So you get a proper programming language. You can interact with C# and F#. You get the whole NuGet library, the whole ecosystem. We get a compiler and an SDK for free, and a very good compiler and SDK in F# and .NET. We get refactorings, you get IntelliSense, type ahead, multiple IDEs, so you could use Code, you could use Rider, you could use Visual Studio, you can use any number of IDEs that support .NET, then they implicitly will support Pharma. And I think this is really the last one that's important, though, is this flexibility. Pharma is not a closed ecosystem, which means that if you need to use it in other ways, you can do. We also have a plugin extensibility model. So you can create your own sort of wrappers around resources. It's just an interface, a .NET interface you need to implement. You can also literally take an ARM resource code, literally the raw JSON, and paste it in as a string, and we will then let that partake in the pipeline. The idea being that you could start from that and then slowly migrate and evolve that into a proper wrapper, but you can do that step by step. We don't want to lose all the benefits of ARM, though, so we still, benefit from them. So we use the Azure CLI because that's really, really a nice way of doing deployments, giving you validation and so on. The CLI is actually very good in that it gives you data back in a parsable JSON format, so we can then parse it and do things with. You get the portal, you get visualization tools, the whole deployment story. You keep all of that. It's just the authoring side of things that has changed, really. Yes, Pharma uses F#. So it's a DSL on top of F#. If you don't know F#, you don't need to know it. I know people that are using it both at Microsoft and outside that are not F# experts. They're in fact not even .NET experts. But because we've provided this DSL, you can basically get things up and running relatively quickly. And if you do need to go further, F# is really not difficult. It's a general purpose programming language. It's got a very lightweight syntax. It's really not hard. So, don't let that stop you from looking at it. Even if you use it in an isolated way as a DSL, it's still, I would maintain, much easier than JSON and ARM. As I mentioned, F# can also be consumed from C#. So you could have a C# web app, for example, or a cake script that calls to F#. It's just another assembly in .NET. You can create your new abstractions in C# because it's just an interface. And just to remind you, F# is not hard. Okay. I don't want to lie and say there is no such thing as a free lunch. There are some things that we don't support in Pharma deliberately. So we don't support arbitrary parameters. We don't think it's really necessary for 99% of the use cases we see. You can parameterize your code in F# and use your F# as your parameter point, and then emit different templates for different environments, for example. You don't need variables in your ARM template because, again, you could do them in F#. It's not a problem. We don't support Ling templates, but we really haven't seen any need for them, and certainly no feedback on that. And as I said before, we don't support every feature of every resource. However, we do add in ones as there is demand for them. So we do have a roadmap, but basically, if there's something that you need, let us know. Just briefly talk about some future plans we've got for Pharma, where we want to take it. So First thing is, as I said, support for more ARM resources. We think we've got a pretty decent amount already, but we want to continue to add on to them. There are a few that we see asked for frequently that we're going to probably look at next, but we think we have a pretty good set now of what I would consider 90% of what most people we see use. So things like subscription level resources we want to add support for. We want to also add more typing. So we want to make validation even better. We want to make more typing so that it's easier to see errors as soon as you start typing rather than running the app or deploying into Azure. But we also want to stay pragmatic. We don't want to make it a Haskell kind of thing with types everywhere. So back and forwards. So David asked the question, would you consider Pharma as easy to adopt technology for IT pros that oftentimes don't have experience from real programming languages? I would say yes. That would be obviously my point of view. But as I mentioned before, we've got people from Microsoft working on Azure teams that are using this now that literally have other people that have written their templates in batch scripts and things like this. And they're now using Pharma instead. As I showed you before, the language is not difficult, the DSL. It's basically keywords with some key value pairs, generally. So even for those sort of simple cases, you'll be fine. If you're using ARM templates today, you're already having to invest, I would say, a lot of time and energy into learning how to work with JSON files. If you're using PowerShell or Azure Client batch files, you're already doing probably some kind of fault handling and error handling and conditional logic and so on. To me, that's no real different from what I'm seeing there. So I would say try it for your team. I would certainly say there's nothing stopping you doing it. The only tooling you need is the Azure CLI, which you'll already have, hopefully, and the .NET runtime, .NET Core runtime, which is a single install. You probably already are using VS Code if you're doing ARM, so there's no real difference there. API ergonomics, we just want to make it a bit nicer and easier to work with. We want to look at things as well, and these will be a bit further down the pipeline, but looking at tools like ADF, Logic Apps, and Azure Active Directory, which contain a kind of embedded logic inside the ARM template for parts of their tooling. So ADF, you can actually embed in the ARM template the actual pipelines that you're running. Logic Apps, you can do the orchestration. Azure B2C, you can do the skinning of the customer login page, for example. Those are things that we want to see if we can add extensions to allow you to create that code as well directly in Pharma in a kind of a similar experience as an add-in optional. We think that would be a really nice extension where you can still use ARM templates, but you have a much easier way to construct these kind of pipelines and so on. Question from the NNUG Oslo user group. I want to contribute. Should I be more ARM template expert or F#? I would prefer the ARM template side. The F# code is not that tricky, and I'm always happy to help. The ARM template is 90% of the effort we put into adding a new resource, I would suggest. Nearly all the effort is looking through the documentation, understanding how it works, looking at the distinctions, and I'll show you in a minute actually what that means. But that's really where we spend most of the time. The actual F# code is really not that challenging. It's really a couple of mappings from one data structure to another and then pushing it out into JSON, basically. It's not that difficult. Most of the sort of the framework is there. It's really just now rinse and repeat to understand what the fields are that we need to do and pushing them out. One thing we'd like to add in the future would be also getting some more live data using what we call type providers in F#. So imagine that you could say, for example, VM images dot and get a live list directly from the marketplace of all the available images. That's something that would be another nice to have. It's a bit of effort to do, but it would, I think, be a nice value add as well. Question then from Lars, how would you typically use Pharma with an existing CI/CD pipeline where you are today including ARM template deploys? So the only real difference would be that instead of source controlling your ARM template, you would source control your Pharma code. And then in your CI/CD, you build your Pharma project. That can actually just be a script in F#, which also supports that. And then you would emit the ARM template as part of that CI/CD process. Now, that could be part of your build process, which would then emit the ARM template and then get persisted as an artifact. And then you could push that out to whatever environment you want, really. But it's the only difference is instead of you source controlling ARM, Farmer becomes your source of truth. And then everything else after that is just a transient or ephemeral sort of file, which ends up in the portal. And that's what we're doing today for most of our deployments now. Yevgeny, I know it's 6 o'clock. Do we have 5 minutes more, or should we call it a day?
Yes, of course, you have 5 minutes more.
Great, okay. So I just want to give you an example of what the actual user group you guys mentioned just a few minutes ago about the ARM template stuff. So I want to give you an example of how we map some of the more difficult parts of Azure or not into F#. So the storage SD SKU is something we did relatively recently. We sort of revamped this and we did a full implementation of how you model this. And there's kind of two parts to it. You have the kind, of which there's general purpose V1 and V2. And you've got files, blobs, and block blobs accounts. And you've also got replication, which is local, zone, geo-redundant. There's 5 kinds of that. And then you've got a performance tier. The question is, what are the valid combinations? Which ones go with which? And it turned out actually that this was harder to find out than I thought it would be. So you can look on the documentation about the SKU, and it tells you you've got these different types of things, these replication models. Okay. And then you look somewhere else and you find there's a kind, which is these 5 different storage kinds. Then you find there's an access tier as well called hot or cool. And in reality, there's actually 3, but there's an archive level as well. But this is the 2 that you can specify as the default level. Interestingly, it gives you this rule here where kind is blob storage. So please don't set the access tier if you set any of the other ones. You're not allowed to do that. Then you can find another page that shows you this crazy table of different things and different rules, which, the last one said hot or cool. This one now says for general purpose, hot, cool, or archive. Down here, hot, cool, or archive as well. Which is right, which one's wrong? You have these different options here. Then there's another one we found, which was the different combinations, and really, really complicated. And we really couldn't find it. Eventually we did, and it turned out you could model the entire thing in 6 or 7 lines of code of F#. So you say we have a type of SKU, which is either general purpose blobs, blocks, or files. General purpose then is either V1 or V2. If it's V1, we have LRS or GRS or RAGers. And if it's LRS, it can either be storage or premium. V2 replication has the same thing, except it also adds on a couple more types of replication and so on and so forth. This is now built into the type system. So it's impossible in Farmer to actually create an invalid combination now, because we've sort of specified all of these rules. The compiler won't let us even do this accidentally. And then we can sort of make this a bit easier with some ready-made sort of members. So if you want a standard LRS, we'll just create you a general purpose V2 LRS standard. This is pretty, it's not crazy code. And I would suggest that it's probably easier to read these lines of code than it is to wade through these sometimes contradictory documentation. Here, this is the source of truth. The code doesn't lie, assuming that it's in sync with the reality of Azure. Okay. I already touched on Farmer's opinionated. So we don't want to support everything in ARM, or at least we don't think it's possible to support everything up front. So our sort of view is to target, 80-20, the most common use cases, and as people ask for more, we'll add them in, not a problem. How do I get started? If you've got .NET Core, you can get VS Code. There's an F# extension called Ironide, or you can use VS 2019 or Rider. That's all you need. You'll already have F# then. We also have a .NET template that will create sort of a project with the latest version of the Farmer package. That's basically it. The docs I've already showed you, but I'll just jump back there again. So it's just compositional IT, GitHub IO/Farmer. If you Google it, it'll be the first hit you find. We've got, like I said, quick starts, all the different resources. There's a handy sort of comparison table of Farmer and ARM. I'll talk about some of these briefly now. Got some testimonials. Also, I would just talk about, it's actually on the slide deck, I believe. So let me just jump back here. Okay, good. So I assume there are people here that have heard of Pulumi and or Bicep. I'm just going to talk about them briefly because it's worth addressing the distinctions between them. So Pulumi is really excellent tech. I would suggest if you don't want to use Farmer, for whatever reason, use Pulumi, use something, don't use raw ARM. That's kind of the main takeaway from this. If anything, avoid ARM templates by default. That would be my advice. Pulumi's great. Try it out. I would not consider Farmer a direct compete with it. Obviously, we're in the same space, but Farmer is much more opinionated in that it's a single platform. It's directly coupled to ARM templates. So we deliberately built on top of ARM. It's a single language only, it's F#, whereas Pulumi are targeting multiple languages. And the other difference is, again, that we have crafted these kind of abstractions rather than with Pulumi, which is more of an auto-generation approach. There's swings and roundabouts to both. As you say, you can get much more rapid access to new resources, whereas with Farmer, I think part of the benefit of what we do is to come up with abstractions that try to fit with how people work, rather than just a one-to-one mapping with what the ARM templates have. Bicep is, I think, a slimmer version of ARM. So there's a good and bad side to that. It's a one-to-one mapping, so you get all the resources out of the box, but you don't benefit from any changes in abstractions or simplifications in terms of how you think about modeling. It definitely looks better than raw ARM. It's still not Turing complete though. So if you want to do for loops, if you want to do comprehensions, you might have some of that. If you want to use NuGet packages, forget it. If you want to do more complicated typings and so on, you're not going to be able to do that. It's still an alpha. I don't know how long it's going to be until it's V1, probably still middle of next year, I would guess at the earliest. They are building a completely new ecosystem. It's a brand new language. There's still issues on there like IntelliSense, or at least they were the last time I checked. It's a brand new CLI, IDE tooling has to be built in, a compiler, parser. All of these things are things that we didn't want to do. Hence why we've sat on top of the Azure CLI, the F# language, all of that stuff. So if you know ARM today and you don't want to learn something new, you're still going to have to learn something with Bicep. The abstraction is the same, but it's a brand new language, completely different. How can you get involved? I would say the most important thing is just try it out. Try it out, see what you find. Let us know if you've got issues with it, if there's ways we can improve the docs, which for us is super important. We want to make it as easy for people to start using Farmer. So if there's things that are missing from the docs, let us know. So feedback, resources you want, things that didn't work, if there's confusing, documentation you could add. There are people that are adding in new resources because they need them for their projects. They might not be common resources, but people are adding them nonetheless. So that's, I'm really happy about that. And just tell others about it. So, Evgeny's point at the start, he's not the first person that has come to us and said, I wish I'd have known about Farmer 3 months ago, 6 months ago. So if you've got other people that are doing infrastructure as code on Azure, let them know. You may save them a lot of time. As I mentioned earlier on, we've got commercial support. So we only recommend Farmer for free, for non-production use. If you've got issues with it, you can raise issues on GitHub. You can contact us through GitHub. We can't promise to fix them in any time frame. If they don't fulfill with what our roadmap is, we may not ever get to them. If you pay for a support package with that, then we'll take that a lot more seriously. We've got SLAs on fixing issues. You have direct channels to the team and so on. Just some links I'll show you at the end here. So I already showed you the Farmer website. There's also our GitHub website. So I'll just go to Farmer. Here we go. So there's the GitHub repo. You can see all the code on there. You'll see we have a reasonable amount of forks and so on. We've got 50 people that have contributed to it. Obviously, that's not everyone. I'm probably one of the, or CIT are the main contributor, but we do have people from Microsoft that are contributing on a regular basis to the project as well. Have a look through it if you're curious about the code as well. If you're curious about F#, then have a look on Microsoft's site. They've got a lot of information on there as well. I would finish with just, I know I've had a few questions already, but feel free to ask any more now. And if not, you can always email me, isaac@compositional-it.com. You can get me on Twitter @Isaac_Abraham. If you Google me, there aren't too many Isaac Abrahams that do F#, so you're sure to find me even on Google. But yeah, that's it pretty much. So thank you very much. If you've got any more questions, please fire them now.
Yes, thank you, Isaac. So I actually have one question. So what is the typical time to onboarding, for example, new developer in Farmer? So let's say if I want to contribute, how much time do I think I will need to spend before I will start to be productive in the code base?
Depends on what parts you want to add on. So there are some issues that we've got that are like good first time issues. So it might be something like add a single keyword. So a good example is like on the portal now, we actually have an issue that someone just raised the other day, which is I want to add a 64-bit worker support for web apps. That's just a single keyword that will essentially add in this one flag. Where is it? Allows use 32-bit worker process. That's something that would actually go all the way through the whole stack, but it's a single value that you'd need to add in. We also have on the website, we actually have a kind of a tutorial for actually starting up yourself a contributions guide. So there's like a whole guide of how to do things. What do I do? How do I do it? We'll probably want to build on that a little bit, but there's a step-by-step guide to do that. We had someone the other day that created support for site extensions. He basically was able to come up with a PR within, a few hours. And then over the course of a few days, we sort of evolved it a bit further. But it really depends on what you want to do. Someone else provided a PR the other day for diagnostic settings, complete new resource from scratch. So it really depends on how much you want to do. But if you just want to add in little bits and pieces, it may just be a few minutes or maybe an hour to do. If you want to add in more fundamental features, obviously it's a bigger thing. But the code base is not huge. We're not talking tens of thousands of lines of code. It really isn't that big. At its most fundamental, Farmer is basically given a record or a class, convert it into a JSON template. That's basically, it's just a set of mappings that go from there to the other end.
Thanks. We have more questions from Håkon.
Yep. So Håkon, how big is the Farmer organization? So basically, Farmer is run primarily by compositional IT. So we're an organization, we've got less than 10 developers, between 5 and 10 permanent developers. Plus we have contractors on board. We do a whole bunch of other things, like I said, in terms of consultancy and development. But we're an organization that we're investing into Farmer. We're committed to seeing it develop. So it's not a project that we're planning on stopping anytime soon. Is there any support for Logic Apps anytime soon? Yes, there is. That's one of the things that we have as kind of the next thing to add on. As I said to you before, though, Logic Apps is kind of, I would split into two sides. One would be creating the raw resource, and the second bit would be adding a DSL on top that allows you to create the actual orchestration part, which is really what we see as the most pain points with Logic Apps, because it's a complicated sort of DSL that you have to do in JSON. So that would be kind of a two-part process. One, to enable you to create the raw resource and maybe embed the actual orchestration bit as a raw string or something like that. And then over time, build up a proper DSL for that.
Thank you. And then it's not it's more like a comment from David, not really a question.
Yeah, that's interesting. When we last spoke to the Bicep team, they were saying probably mid-2021. So that's good if they're coming up sooner, because that means that things are going to move ahead more quickly. The biggest benefit, I think, with Bicep moving forward quickly is that it encourages all of the ARM teams to get the schemas up and running and the documentation sorted, which I think is probably the biggest blocker at the moment. So that's good to hear, though. That's good.
Yeah, and it's again just a short comment from my side. So I'm not an F# developer, but when I started to work with farmers, it was like no issues at all. And it actually, we already had some library written on C# regarding naming convention, transformer, and other things. So you can just use, if you already use C# or any other .NET language, it works very naturally with F#. So you don't need to be F# expert to work with a farmer. So, and that I think it's a good thing.
Absolutely.
Another question?
Yep. Good question. So can I use Farmer basically from C#? So the Farmer DSL is F# only. There are a number of reasons for that. One is that effectively you can't do the same kind of syntax that we're showing you in Farmer in C#. And for us, one of the benefits we wanted to have was people that are coming from ARM and a kind of a JSON style. It's kind of similar. It's not too foreign. And secondly, there are some things that you can model in F# that you really can't model in C#. So things like union types that you have in F#, you just don't have in C#. Wouldn't really be able to model that so easily today, at least, maybe in C#10. But you can call your Farmer code from C#. So you can create an F# project with your Farmer template, and then effectively have a function that just looks like a method in C#, call it from C# and add any parameters you want onto that. So you can view it as almost a black box, but it will just look like a normal static class with a static method. Yeah, so you can do it that way.
Yeah, so more questions? Yeah, probably not. Then thank you very much for your very good presentation. So actually, even though I worked with Farmer for some time, so I learned a bunch of new things today, and I really like the integration that you have in Visual Studio Code with other ARM template related tools. So that was very good. So thank you very much for your presentation, Isaac, and thank you everyone who joining us today. And yes, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and welcome to the NNUG with new topics. Yeah.
Brilliant.
So thank you very much. Bye bye, guys.
Bye.